Most projects don't get delivered exactly how they were planned at the beginning. That's just the reality. And so what you need is a schedule which is dynamic and data-driven. And of course, weather is a part of that. I'm not saying it is the fundamental factor, but it is a factor which is increasing in importance.
Weather has always been the wild card on a construction site, derailing schedules, inflating budgets, and adding that factor of risk the taller that you build. Yet, for all the talk of digital twins and predictive analytics, weather risk is still too often treated as an unavoidable act of nature rather than a variable that can be measured, priced, and proactively managed. In this episode, we're exploring why weather is moving from just bad luck to board level priority, how climate insight can reshape everything from contracts to profit margins, and what it takes for contractors, insurers, and clients to manage the weather rather than work on a day to day basis that brings nothing but unpredictability with someone that knows his nimbostratus from his cumulonimbus. That's a cloud based joke for any cloud enthusiasts out there. Our guest today is Josh Graham, CEO at eHab. Josh leads a platform built specifically for construction to quantify and manage weather risk with science, not guesswork. eHab's WeatherWise suite maps portfolio exposure, digitally rehearses programs against likely weather windows, and alerts teams to risk before they bite, saving days of manual analysis and giving planners defensible allowances, plugging into construction planning and risk tools to provide granular, project-level insights. Josh is an active voice on weather risk, writing regularly about how data and new insurance models can reduce delays and protect margins as extreme weather events intensify. Just a quick note on the recording of this podcast episode. We had a few connectivity issues, so we've recorded it in two parts, one on one day, one on the other. So apologies if there's a slight change in audio or visual representation. Anyway, the quality, the knowledge, and the expertise from Josh is still there, so enjoy. Josh, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good, Peter. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I want to dive straight in, if you will, because in my intro, I was talking about weather and it being unpredictable and unreliable, particularly in the UK. But that's why you're here, to make it less unpredictable and less unreliable, although you can't necessarily change the weather unless you're going to tell me something I don't know about yourself. Can you just explain a little bit about your background and how WeatherWise has come into existence?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my favorite X-Men characters is Storm, but that's not a superpower that I currently have, unfortunately.
Damn.
So I studied climate science at uni, Peter, and so I've been pretty obsessed with climate change and weather really for the last like 10, 11 years now. And actually, as a young boy, my dad would always watch the weather, and I would like always sit next to him. I don't know, he was a bit of a weather nerd as well, so it's probably been in my blood for a number of years now, just keeping an eye on the rain forecast. But it was yeah, knowing that climate was changing, and really, although we had in 2015 the Paris Climate Summit, which kind of we hoped would set the world on a different path, it doesn't appear, does it, that we're really making progress. We've passed 1.5 degrees, and so it's bringing into the realm of possibility that we actually going to have to really aggressively adapt to the changes that we're seeing. I mean, everyone has probably seen it and felt it. It's always in the news now: heat waves, wildfires, excessive rainfall, flooding, all of the things that ultimately affect us as people, and obviously businesses and the way that they operate as well. So it was this kind of concern that led me and Felipe, who, I met a few years before. We started another business together, which unfortunately failed, but we decided to have another go, and we really wanted to do something impactful. And so it felt like focusing in on construction, which is obviously one of the biggest sectors on the planet, and also one of the least digitized, and helping that create a system which ultimately leads it to become much more resilient to the changes that we're seeing and that we're going to continue to see. That felt like a really significant place to have some impact. And so the journey really for Weatherwise started 5 years ago. The business is called Ehab, but the product that we've launched is Weatherwise, and it's really been an incredible journey just because of how much learning we've done over that time period, because there's so many, as you well know, Peter, nuances to the way construction works and operates. And neither of us have a background in construction. I'm much more on the climate science side, and Felipe is much more on the data and tech side. And so, of course, it's been learning the ins and outs of the industry that's enabled us to then build a solution which, today helps lots and lots of companies across the UK, but also in North America and Europe to tackle this problem. So it's been a very, very interesting journey.
Fantastic. Want to dive into a little bit of the tech just to start off, really. But I'm going to ask you a hugely flippant question, of which I'd like you to elaborate on, and then that'll allow you to dive in a bit more about the technology and what Weatherwise does. But why not just check with the Met Office? I can tell. Well, I'm not with varying degrees of accuracy what the weather's going to do around me. So why bother with Weatherwise? Why not just use the Met Office?
Yeah, and plenty of people do, right, Peter? And I guess the metric that I can immediately point to is about 4 years ago, there was some research done which suggested that about 45% of construction projects were getting delayed by the weather. And some research last year suggests that's now 93%. So if you're doing what you've been doing, which is Met Office, using basic tools, then that's what's going to happen. There's going to be a huge increase in the number of projects being delayed. But maybe to answer it in a more detailed way, it's the weather forecast is obviously a very important tool, but it's just one of the tools in your arsenal. And what it is not very good at is being contextual to the work that you're actually doing. So we think it's really important to ensure that people are not just receiving an information about, okay, it's going to rain at 5 a.m. or this is the weather that's going to occur, but also how does that actually impact my business? What should I do about that forecast? And then not just the next day, the next week, what is the implication for my project, which is maybe 5 years long? And so what we try to do is build out from, the forecast warnings, which enable people to take action on a site from a short-term planning perspective, to then also modeling the 3-year, 5-year, 10 years potentially length of that project, so that you can start to take action as early as possible. Because I think that the key thing with some of these risk management mitigations is the earlier that you can decide that you're going to actually take that action, the more cost effective it's going to be. If you have to decide the day before that you need to spend a load of money to do something, that's obviously going to be quite rushed, and you might have to pay above average for whatever the mitigation is. But if you can identify a year in advance that we're going to need to do this type of thing to mitigate that risk, then that clearly means you have a contingency plan in place. You've already prepaid. You've maybe had a lower cost to taking that action. So for us, it's always about being as proactive as possible and giving people as much visibility over the things that may or may not happen, so that they can have those contingency plans in place.
Fantastic. I can concur with that. We had some building work done a few years ago, and the bricklayer, he basically wouldn't get out of bed if it looked like it was going to rain. So which is hugely frustrating when it didn't rain. Okay, Josh, I just want to move the conversation on slightly from my bricky not turning up and the delays in a small construction, to thinking of more generally about how we look at weather and why you think weather risk is still treated in general more as an inevitable in construction rather than something that can be and should be actively managed.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, look, if when you get your 1 in 100 year storm and it blows everything off your site, then you probably are thinking, well, what could I have done? And to be fair, probably not that much, right? You've got to do
Yeah.
what you can in those scenarios. But I think the thing that we're really seeing, and I think probably everyone's experiencing, it's not just the extremes getting worse, although that is obviously really scary when you see a 1 in 100 year storm now is a 1 in 10 or whatever, but it's also the average weather and that day to day weather just becoming more consistent, and worse in its consistency of how much worse it is, even though there's like that dichotomy of, but it's also getting less predictable. So it's kind of,
Mm.
it's getting worse, but it's less likely to know when that worse is going to happen. I think I mentioned it already, but we were looking at a project in Scotland where now August is their wettest month
Yeah.
for heavy downfalls. So to answer your question, I suppose, Peter, is I think there's that element of, people, when it's the worst case scenario, you can't avoid it. And what we're trying to get people to think through and is that you if you can get 5%, 10% better at dealing with that average weather, which is so much worse, then actually that's where the gains can be made. And I think there's also this piece of kind of in construction, relying on your contract, relying on the fact that, if it breaks a clause, then that's when we claim, but everything else we just have to get on with. And I think, again, there is an element of that, right, where you might have a threshold which says, well, we stop work at a certain amount of rainfall or a certain amount of wind speed. And there's probably always someone on site saying, can we just keep going though? And then you've got that discussion between safety, productivity, and obviously kind of the overall cost base for the project, and that being a kind of a discussion that needs to be being had. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I think, in summary, there is to some extent truth to the weather's just going to happen. But
Yeah.
actually what we're seeing and what we're modeling is that there are so many opportunities, maybe not at that 1 in 100 year storm level, but there are so many opportunities lower down the spectrum where actually there are massive gains to be made.
And if you think about it from where we are within construction right now, and margins being so thin and timelines being so tight to deliver projects, while you were talking, my mind went to, well, I was listening to you, but my subconscious went to the Dave Brailsford British cycling team 1%, and it all matters, and margins thin 1% is astronomical. So if you can get that 1% from something like understanding weather forecast and how that impacts a project, that's like a bit of a game changer, really.
Yeah, and I think the maybe the reticence from people comes from, well, do I now have to do more work to achieve that 1%? And
Mm,
I think it really comes down to the work smarter, not harder.
yeah.
That's the purpose of tech and innovation, is that you can spend maybe an extra 5 minutes, but you get an extra 10 days on your program in terms of benefit.
Yeah, I really like that, in terms of looking at construction like that, because I think historically, being a very manual process on site, it is about working harder. It always has been about working harder or longer. But like you said, the tech now means we can actually work smarter, which is brilliant, absolutely fantastic.
Hmm.
Um, if we look at this from a slightly wider scale, then looking at construction business models, maybe for a company, not just the actual build, how can better climate intelligence help not just project delivery, but almost transform a construction business, or certainly assist a construction business in its entirety to deliver projects, to gain more profit, to be around for longer and help their clients as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, there's like three parts to this, Peter. One
Okay.
is the schedule, right? And the schedule is absolutely what drives margins in construction. And if you don't have that right, or if you don't optimize it, then ultimately you're leaving money on the table, or it's what's going to drive, loss on a particular project, which obviously if you have that in the aggregate, then is going to drive the end of your construction business.
Mm,
It's then the contract and how we set up contracts and how that delegates and allocates risk and risk sharing. And the reality is no one wants any of the companies that they're working with to go bust, and everyone wants everyone to have a healthy margin, because that means stability, and it means people can work under less stress. And so we need to think about contracts. And then the final piece is just resilience, that every single
mm,
business, not just construction, is going to genuinely, probably already is. In the last 6 months, we've seen, and there was a report, I think it was Bain and Company, said that now 93% of boardroom executives in kind of publicly traded companies are putting weather into their annual and quarterly earnings reports, mentioning this as a risk, which means it is being reported at the highest levels of
mm.
many, 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 many companies. So, in terms of those three things, right? Schedule. Clearly, you have to have the most robust, realistic schedule, or else every single decision that is getting made from that schedule, because it's ultimately a decision-making tool. Okay,
Mhm.
what mitigation, acceleration, change are we going to make that's going to lead us to deliver on time? Because, of course, most projects don't get delivered exactly how they were planned at the beginning.
Hmm.
That's just the reality. And so what you need is a schedule which is dynamic and data-driven. And of course, weather is a part of that. I'm not saying it is the fundamental factor, but it is a factor which is
Yeah.
increasing in importance. The contract piece, and this clearly is, where you can have a good or a bad contract, let's say. And I think we have to really get over this concept of using the weather as an excuse, as a way to claim back money, which I know is probably still an idea that is lingering. We have to consider it as, how do we share risk in the best possible way for the success of the project, but also for the success of the stakeholders.
Mhm.
And obviously, when you have a force majeure, you get insurance involved, this sort of stuff. But there are much better ways that we could be dealing with and sharing that risk. And I think that's where that climate intelligence piece for both schedule and contract really comes in at the earliest phases of the project, because it means you have to be making decisions where you're thinking years in advance and basically saying, look, we know that this is of importance. We know that this could be the thing that pushes us to finish the project late, or to have margins cut in half. So that's something, that's the really important piece. And then the final message is, if you're not a business thinking about climate resilience, then what are you doing? Because it's so in the face of every single company
Mm.
now. And you might think, well, England's weather, it's getting a bit wetter, but you've got to remember you're connected to a global supply chain, and it's the weather everywhere is getting worse. And so that delivery of steel you were going to get from India or whatever it might be is in this interconnected web of things where the whole system is getting percentage points worse and worse every year. And so, the obvious example is COVID, where maximum ultimate disruption.
Mm.
But there's smaller, there's other effects like that have had the crazy ripple effects in the economy in terms of inflation of materials, that sort of thing. And I bet good money on there being more of those that impacts construction in the future, where it's nothing related to bad weather in the UK, but it impacts the sector in a meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to turn the dial really inward facing here,
Mm,
and we've spoken quite a bit about the unpredictable nature of weather at this moment in time, um, and what you've managed to do is provide something so that people can see in advance when disruption may happen, and then apportion time to that and shift things around, and that helps, like we've just discussed, for an entire business. But how do you build trust in the accuracy of your data and forecasts and what you provide with this, what probably is in most people's minds the unpredictability that we are continually getting for weather now.
Yeah, I think there's a few things, right? And in construction, you've got really technical people, engineers, schedulers, risk managers. They all think about things in a slightly different way to maybe Joe Blogs on the street, right? For good reason. You'd hope so, right? Given they're building our bridges. And so I think they really want to pick apart and understand how something works, and that's how they understand something. So, right at the start, I think someone told us, when it's a black box, I can't trust it. And so
Right.
throughout the process of building out EHAB business and Weatherwise, the platform, we've really tried to, not always as well as we could have, but now I think we are doing it quite well, where everything is explained, every step is made very clear, so that, and you can skip those steps, right? You don't have to go through them every time. But I think if you are the first, second, third time you're using it, you want to spend the extra hour that you wouldn't want to spend once you know how it works and once you do trust it. So that's one piece, is making sure that users are really clear on how and why, and not making it some, just like AI is doing this for you. It's actually, well, this is the data, these are the steps, this is the mechanics, these are the levers you can tweak that influences the result. And I think the other piece is obviously just results. So, it's the more projects that we've got on board, I think we've got like over 200 now. We can show in the aggregate how many days we're saving. So, if you zoom into one project, obviously we can get it wrong. But that's what we try to say to people is, well, you are a construction company managing 100 projects. You're already doing this to some extent. You're already making weather decisions in the aggregate, and you're hoping that they go your way. And all our tool is going to do is push up the accuracy of all of those projects, so that in the aggregate, you are the 5% better, which results in the, how many millions of savings that you're ultimately going to make. So I think that's the data story that we try to tell at the high level. And it's obviously good that the tool actually works, so that we have data to back that up.
That always helps, doesn't it? With tech,
does.
when it does work, it's always a bit of a bonus. And I suppose from your perspective as well, there is no hiding from whether it has worked or not. It's not like the majority of tech, where it's a platform, it does a particular thing, and most of the time it's user error, or the thing isn't fit for purpose or what you originally thought. You're front facing, right? If it's raining, it's raining. If it's not, it's not. So it sort of, you have to show that it works, because people are going to see it regardless.
And I'll tell you about a failure or two. We've had many, but these are the ones where we lost the customer. So I won't obviously name them, but it actually wasn't related to the weather piece. It was related to how our tool read the schedule. And this is where you would probably want to avoid doing too many things, because the schedule and P6 and Asta and the way that those different tools, it's kind of like Excel, where you have so much ability to, so much freedom in those tools to create different dependencies and logic in the schedule. You've probably heard about schedule hygiene, right? We thought, oh yeah, there'll be 50 to 100 edge cases that we need to deal with. And we're still finding them, thousands of edge cases down the road. And you think, I thought we'd fixed this now. So, early on, there was errors reading the schedule. And obviously it doesn't matter how good the weather model is. If the schedule you've read is wrong, or the way that you've read the schedule is wrong, then it doesn't work, does it?
Yeah. And as with most tech, it's iteration after iteration. It gets better and better over time. The first thing that's launched is never the thing that is today and present. And it's certainly about learning and developing and building. And I think you said it a few minutes ago, the more projects you're on, the better the tech becomes, right? So yeah, I mean, fair play that your tech actually worked, but it was the connectivity and things like that you didn't necessarily see or understand. And these things are going to happen. and I really appreciate the honesty there. Okay, final thing from me. I just want to get a bit more creative here, because I think within any walk of life there are myths or I don't know if you call them truisms or old wives' tales or whatever you want to class them as. But what are these? Are there any myths around weather or weather predictions, or in your line of industry, climate that are quite tough to shift? Or when you go into a pitch, are you talking to clients and they say something, can you just like, yeah, I get that a lot, but actually X, Y, and Z. Is there anything like that that's still around with weather?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think probably the question you already asked, right? Isn't weather impossible to predict? And oh, the weatherman never gets it right, or whatever it is, right? That is a consistent one. I would say the ones in construction that are harder to shift are kind of baked into the way that like contracts or schedules work. So I think, I don't know if it's a myth, but it's like it's a mindset framing perhaps of weather is only something we can claim. I think I've mentioned it a couple times, and it's this myth that like forward looking, there's nothing you can do about it. Like the question you already asked me as well. And so therefore, all I care about is, well, what happened, and did what happened break my contractual thresholds? And you can see why that might not make sense. If you are never looking forward, you're only looking back, then if you were doing that whilst driving, well, you'd be crashing all the time and being like, oh yeah, we've crashed again. It wouldn't make for a very safe journey. So that I think is probably the myth that like we come up against so many times. So it's another non-myth, Peter. So sorry for dodging the question, but it's about knowing how much rain is actually going to delay you. So
okay,
it's easy with temperature to say, well, 0 degrees is freezing, and so my concrete I can't pour if it's below 3 degrees, or certain materials will have degrees, and because of that concept of, well, I know how cold freezing is, I think it frames it in your mind quite well. When you ask someone, well, how much rain will delay earthworks, or will delay some sort of coating that you're doing on some metal or whatever work it is, and then you say, well, how many millimeters is that, and how many millimeters is in an hour or in a day or over what period, you start to get mixed up. And then when you also factor in that if you're on clay versus chalk versus rock versus whatever is the soil type, you then add a whole other series of factors in there, which is exactly why EHAB exists, because the only way you would know all of those factors of things is if you're someone who's worked on clay soil for the last 20 years, you've been through every single winter, you've seen it all. But you may not know what it's like on chalk, but you'll know what your rain thresholds are on clay. And it's kind of, I suppose, these myths of, well, I know best is maybe the myth there. Is like, I know best because I've been on this soil this many times, I've done it before.
Yeah.
And the myth breaks when climate change, and then when you move that person to anywhere except where they've been working for the last 20 years.
Yeah,
so
sure.
It's kind of that myth busting that we really are trying to break through. And obviously the fact of the matter is a lot of folks are retiring. And so a lot of that knowledge may be disappearing. And so then it's, younger folks who are coming through who haven't had the experience and climate change, where you then need to say, well, let's take a data-driven approach to it.
Yeah, fantastic. Josh, really interesting, really informative and knowledgeable. It's certainly, if not the only piece of tech that I've spoken to somebody about, which I wouldn't have thought would exist within construction. And talking to you and seeing what it does, it's certainly needed and can help a lot of people in the industry. So thank you so much for sharing, for recording and then coming back and recording the final piece. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.